Well, here we are, day 4 or 5, I'm not sure how many, of social distancing. Hope you're all doing well. One of the things that we were doing in the co-op before all of this craziness happened was we were doing our midweek Lenten series. And this year we were focusing on the theme of following Jesus with a number of different historical figures and saints from the history of the church. And so we thought that we would try to continue that, at least via this method. I know it doesn't lend itself to you being able to ask questions. If you have questions, by all means, you can email those to me, and I will sort of post answers to those on the website as we go forward. As we talk about following Jesus, what we're really talking about is a word that Lutherans don't use real often, or not as often as some other traditions. But what we're really talking about when we talk about following Jesus is something called spirituality. And spirituality is a way in which we live out what we believe. So if theology is about examining what are the things we believe about God, about Jesus, about how God interacts with the world, spirituality is, well, how then do we live in relationship with God based on what we believe? So we've been looking at the spiritualities of various people. We started the first week with John the Evangelist, the author of John's Gospel. Last week, we heard from my wife, Pastor Gretchen, about the Desert Mothers and Fathers and their unique spirituality. And this week, we are going to hear about a saint from the Roman Catholic tradition, Saint Ignatius, who was the founder of the Jesuits. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, now wait a minute, why are we hearing about a Catholic saint? We're Lutherans. Yeah, okay, I get it. We're Lutherans, we don't do saints, whatever. Trust me, Ignatius is a guy you need to know about, a guy you want to know about, because he lived at almost the same time as Martin Luther. Their lives kind of overlapped, and I believe that if they had ever had a chance to actually meet and get to know each other, they probably would have been friends. Because a lot of what Ignatius says about spirituality really jives with what Luther says about theology and vice versa. Now, Luther himself wrote a fair bit about spirituality, and Ignatius, his spirituality was grounded in a particular theology. So it's not like one of them was all spiritual and the other one was all theological. But Ignatius was more heavily weighted, maybe would be a way to say it, in the direction of spirituality. And so his spirituality has continued to come down to us across the centuries, particularly through the continued existence of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, which is the Roman Catholic order that he founded. So for this discussion today, I'm going to be basing a lot of it on a really great book I want to show you. This is The Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything by Father James Martin, Society of Jesus. That S.J. there next to his name means he is a Jesuit. And it's a great book for understanding Ignatius's spirituality. And even if you're not Catholic, even if you're not Christian, it opens up a way of relating to the world, of relating to God, of relating to yourself that I think is pretty helpful. Thus the fact that we're going to be talking about Ignatius today. So, to start with, Ignatius was born in 1481. He was a young noble. He was born in a place called Loyola, Spain. Thus the fact that we call him Ignatius of Loyola. He was born, I'm sorry, I think I said a minute ago he was born in 1481. He was born in 1491, excuse me. So he was born just a year before Columbus's voyage to the New World, and he was born 8 years after Martin Luther. So again, they're contemporaries. He was born into a noble family. His family lived in a castle, literally. And he spent his early life training to be a soldier and an official in the court of a nobleman. And by all accounts, he was kind of a snot. Um, he liked to wear his armor around town to impress people, even when there was nobody to fight. Wore a lot of fancy clothes. He was kind of a dandy. And he was always wanting to impress women. He was really kind of a ladies' man. And he was actually at one point arrested for brawling with intent to cause serious harm. In fact, one Jesuit historian says he may be the only Roman Catholic saint with a notarized police record. So that's kind of the way Ignatius lives for the first 30 years of his life. And in 1521, when he's 30 years old, he's serving as a soldier during the siege of a city called Pamplona. You may have heard of it. It's where they do the running of the bulls. And during that siege at Loyola, his leg is shattered by a cannonball. And it's obviously a very serious wound. So he undergoes 2 operations under the surgical practices of the 16th century, which were not very advanced, and somehow manages to survive both of those surgeries and is sent home to the family castle in Loyola to convalesce, to heal and recuperate. While he's convalescing, he can't get his hands on any of the kinds of books that he likes to read. He likes to read adventure stories, stories about manly men doing manly things with manly implements, and he wants to read romance stories about knights in shining armor. Okay. Unfortunately, there don't seem to be any of those around. But his sister-in-law gives him 2 books. One is about the life of Jesus, the other is about the lives of the saints. And as Ignatius starts reading those, he finds himself more and more drawn to them, and he becomes less interested in feats of daring do to impress noble ladies, and more interested in serving God and dedicating his life to the service of God. And at a certain point, about 8 months into his convalescence, he decides that that's what he's going to do. Thank God for coffee. So, in late 1521, early 1522, he's pretty well convalesced. He's healed from the leg wound. And against the wishes of his family, who wanted him to continue being, heir to a noble house, he dedicates his life to the service of God. He takes a pilgrimage to a monastery in Montserrat, Spain, and he completely repudiates his former life. He takes off all of his fancy clothes and gives them to beggars. He takes his armor and his sword and lays it at the feet of a statue of the Virgin Mary, and he enters into a monastic life. Like Martin Luther, again, there's so many parallels here. Luther, you may know, was originally supposed to be a lawyer. His father wanted him to be a lawyer, and he was actually studying law until he had sort of a religious experience. His was fear for his life during an extremely violent thunderstorm, at which point he decided to become a monk. Like Luther, also, Ignatius, in his first couple of years in monastic life, really kind of goes overboard, really damages his own health, trying to live this very rigorous ascetic spirituality. And over time, eventually, he comes to see that this is not where God is calling him, or what God is calling him to do anyway. And he sort of moderates his practice. He sort of comes back to the center and lives, a monastic life, but without like starving himself or denying himself sleep and some of the other things that he had been doing. He does come to believe that if he's going to serve God adequately, he's going to need to finish his education, which, as a young nobleman was not something super important to him. So he enrolls in school, goes back to school, and starts learning all of the things that would be taught in a medieval or Renaissance university, even going so far as to enroll in remedial Latin with young, what we would consider elementary school aged boys, because his Latin was so bad he needed to brush it up like that. And over the course of this time, while he is in university in Spain, and he's studying and learning the things that he thinks are going to help him serve God, he's continuing to grow in his own understanding of God. He's praying, he's doing other things as part of his lifestyle of service of God, and he's carrying a little book around with him and writing these things down as ideas come to him, as he has insights, and as he feels God speaking to him, not necessarily in an actual voice, but he feels the nudge of the Holy Spirit in different ways. And at one point, this actually gets him in trouble. He actually gets arrested by the Spanish Inquisition and spends 17 days in prison before they release him, because they think that his ideas about relating to God are so suspicious. So eventually in 1534, so now this is 13 years, 12 years after he entered the monastery, he eventually makes his way to Paris. And when he gets to Paris, he's 43 years old, and he goes to study at the University of Paris. And while he is there, in 1534, he and 6 others bind themselves together in a mutual vow of chastity and poverty and service to God. And Ignatius and those other 6 guys become the starting core of what becomes the Jesuit order, the Society of Jesus. To form a Catholic order, you have to have permission from the Pope, and so Ignatius and the others write to the Pope in Rome and ask for permission to found a new order called the Society of Jesus, and they don't really get anywhere. A lot of people are suspicious. For one thing, they're considered to be arrogant. Who are you to call yourselves the Society of Jesus? And again, some of Ignatius's ideas about spirituality are met with some suspicion, and we'll talk about what those ideas were a little bit more in a minute. But over this time, he develops a program of spirituality called the Spiritual Exercises, which is still in use today. And he continues to try to work to get papal approval for this order. In 1537, he is ordained a priest and goes to work in a Roman Catholic parish in Rome. And during this time, he gradually wins over some of his critics by explaining what it is he's trying to do and what he wants the Society of Jesus to be. And he actually leads some of his detractors through the spiritual exercises, and they become some of his biggest advocates. So finally, in 1540, Pope Paul III grants approval for the Society of Jesus, or what we now know as the Jesuits. Jesuit was originally sort of a derisive term applied by his critics, just in the same way that Protestant was originally a derisive term applied by people who did not support the Reformation. So Ignatius spends the rest of his life then in Rome as the superior of the Jesuits, and works tirelessly. Here again, a parallel with Luther. He's always busy. He's always engaged. He's always driven, in a sense, by this desire to move forward the work of God as he understands it. He sends out missionaries all over the world. He corresponds with Jesuit communities all over Europe and eventually all over the world. This is a period when Europeans are being able to spread out not only to what we think of as the Americas now, but into Asia and other places. Travel was becoming easier and safer, and so missionaries were going out all over the world, and he's sending out missionaries, and once they arrive where they're going, he's corresponding with them. Again, this is a parallel with Luther. Luther was a tireless letter writer, Ignatius even more so. He actually wrote more letters than Martin Luther and John Calvin combined. He wrote over 6,000 letters in his lifetime. He also founded Rome's first orphanage. He opened a school for boys in Rome that eventually became a university. He founded a house for former sex workers to help them find a different path in life. He was just genuinely a driven person. But at the same time, his contemporaries describe him as being a very gentle and loving and kind soul, affectionate, compassionate, quick to laugh, and often moved to tears during meditation or prayer or during the Mass. So he's really kind of a complex character, and he continues to serve this growing religious order of the Society of Jesus until his death in July of 1556. So he dies 10 years after Luther. He was born 8 years after Luther. So really you can see how their lives kind of overlap. So that's just a very quick, very surface level thumbnail examination of Ignatius's life. Sorry about the background noise. The cat does not want me to ignore her right now. So let's talk a little bit about what Ignatian spirituality or Jesuit spirituality looks like. Again, following in the footsteps of Father James Martin here, he sort of lays out 4 pillars of Jesuit spirituality, and 4 ideas that guide and influence and shape Ignatian spirituality. The first one being the idea of finding God in all things, that we find God not just in the scriptures, not just in worship, not just inside the church, but everywhere. That every moment of our lives is suffused by the presence of God, and that we can literally find God in all things and in all people. Every person is marked with the image of God. Every moment is touched by God. All of creation has God's fingerprints on it. Again, this is very similar to what Luther thought. Luther at one point wrote, God writes the gospel not in the Bible alone, but also on trees and in the flowers and clouds and stars. So again, maybe a little bit different way of saying it, but a very similar idea of where God is found. And this is one of the ideas that got him in trouble with the Inquisition back when he was first getting started in the 1520s, because if I can find God in all things and I can directly communicate with God, well, then why do I need the institutional church? And they thought that Ignatius was critiquing or trying to undermine the institutional church, which he definitely was not. Again, Luther didn't think he was trying to undermine the institutional church either. He thought he was trying to reform it. And it's interesting to me how Luther and Ignatius believed a lot of the same things, said a lot of the same things, did a lot of the same things. Ignatius became a saint. Luther was branded a heretic and excommunicated. I kind of know why that is, and maybe we'll talk about that someday, but it's just interesting to me. So the idea here of finding God in all things, to quote Father Martin in his book, the beginning of the path to finding God is awareness. Not simply awareness that you can find God, but awareness that God desires to find you. there's this idea of intimacy with God, that God is closer to us than our own self. God is as close to us as our next breath. That we can find God literally anywhere and in all things. Even something as mundane as washing the dishes or mowing the grass or taking the trash out. So that's one of the first, or the first pillar, is this idea of finding God in all things. The second one is the idea of being a contemplative in action. Now, what does that mean? Contemplative spirituality is this idea of taking time to reflect on and notice the presence of God in the world. And for a lot of the Roman Catholic orders of Ignatius' day, that was done behind closed doors, in cloisters, in monasteries, in convents, and it was a matter of withdrawing from the world, similar to what Pastor Gretchen described last week with the Jesuit mothers, or the desert mothers and fathers, that we withdraw from the world so that we're not distracted by all of that stuff. And one of the things that made it difficult for the Jesuits to get approval was this idea that they were going to be contemplatives in action, that they were not going to be living a cloistered or sequestered life, but that they were going to be engaged with the world as part of their contemplative prayer and work. And this is one of the things that Ignatius was very adamant about, that he wanted the brothers and the members of the Society of Jesus to be engaged in the world. And that carries with it, or requires, adopting a contemplative or meditative stance to the world. Again, this grows out of finding God in all things, that we look at the world from a contemplative standpoint. We look at the world as everything we see is an invitation from God to be aware of God's presence. And it flows out of the awareness of God in all things, because the awareness of God in all things leads us to the contemplation of God in our daily activities. Think of it as multitasking. I mean, I have some issues with the term multitasking, but as an example, while I'm washing the dishes, I can be thanking God for the gift of water, and for the gift of food that was on those dishes, and for, a healthy body that enables me to stand at the sink and wash those dishes. You get the idea. This also means that all of life is both an opportunity and a subject matter for prayer. Everything that happens during the course of our day is part of our life, which means it's part of our life in God, and it's fair game for our prayer life with God. And it leads us into a cyclical pattern of action, where we do action, we go out into the world and we do the work that God sets before us to do. And then we stop for a moment and take stock and contemplate and be aware of where God was at work in our life today. And then we go back into the world and do more action based on that contemplation. And then we come back and contemplate on that new action. So you see, it's action and contemplation, action and contemplation. We're going to get into that more in a video that I'm going to post tomorrow. The third pillar of Jesuit spirituality, so we have finding God in all things, being contemplatives in action. The third one is looking at the world in an incarnational way. That God is not just out there in the universe somewhere beyond us, but is also here and present in our lives. Again, all of these sort of grow out of one another. And it brings with it the realization that everything, if God is in everything, and if God is present in all things, then everything that we do is an offering to God. And we listen to those still small voices, those little nudges in our spirit, because those are how God speaks to us. Again, this is very near to Martin Luther's idea of vocation and his idea of the immanence or the continuous presence of God. Martin Luther talked about when he was talking about vocation and how does a Christian shoemaker glorify God in his work as a shoemaker? And Luther said he glorifies God in his work as a shoemaker not by putting little crosses on all of his shoes, but by making good quality shoes, because God cares about the people who will eventually wear those shoes. And this is very, I think, again, right in line with what Ignatius is talking about, that when we see the world in an incarnational way, then we see everything we do as an opportunity to make an offering to God. So then the fourth pillar of Ignatian spirituality or Jesuit spirituality is the idea of seeking freedom and detachment. That we don't get tied down by disordered affections. That's Ignatius's term, disordered affections for unimportant things. That, yes, we appreciate, for instance, the material blessings in our lives, but we don't let those become the center of our lives. I can appreciate this painting of a cow on the wall behind me and be grateful that I have it. But if it, gets ruined, it's not going to ruin my life, because my life is more important than that one thing. Ignatius really believed in this and practiced this and encouraged his Jesuits to practice this as a way of being open to the next new thing that God is doing. And I think particularly for us as church, this is an important thing to think about, because so often we get so tied to one thing, whether it's a particular ministry or a way of doing things or a tradition, that we can't let that go. And because we can't let it go, we can't be open to the possibility that God is doing something new. And again, very much in line with what Luther had to say. In the Large Catechism, Luther talks about having no other gods before God. You shall have no other gods before me, the first commandment. And in his explanation of the first commandment in the Large Catechism, Luther says, a God, lowercase g, is nothing more and nothing less than that to which we look for ultimate security. And Luther said, you show me where you put your ultimate trust, and I will show you what your God is. And then he goes on to talk about, the false gods that we look to for security, whether it's our health or our family or our wealth or any of those things, that if we place any of those things first ahead of God, we have an idol. Luther talks about it as having an idol or a false god. Ignatius talks about it as a disordered affection. But again, very similar concept. A more modern way of saying it is that we kind of all have a God-shaped hole in the middle of us, and we try to fill that hole with all kinds of things. We see people trying to fill that hole with material success or wealth or drugs or alcohol or sex or any number of other things, approval of others, you name it, when really the only thing that's going to fill that is God, because it is a God-shaped hole. Along with this idea of freedom and detachment, and contrary to a lot of other spiritual writers and a lot of other traditions, Ignatius encourages his followers, he encourages the Jesuits to pay attention to their desires. And in the course of paying attention to our desires, recognizing how God speaks to us through our desires. And that Our desires are one of two ways. There are those that bring us a sense of peace and contentment and joy, and those are often a hint as to where God may be calling us to be. You know, when we think about the things we want in life, after we're done thinking about those things, do we feel content? Do we feel filled up? Do we feel at peace? If so, Ignatius would say, well, those are desires that are congruent with God's desires for us. If, on the other hand, after thinking about them, we feel empty or hungry or restless, then maybe those aren't from God. But he says, God gave us desires for a reason. Like everything else, sometimes our desires are warped by the reality of sin. But those desires can be a hint for us of where God is calling us to go and to be. If, for instance, we feel a strong desire to be helping other people or to be helping children, well, perhaps God is calling us to be a teacher, and there's then additional layers of unpacking that to really find out where God is calling us. But oftentimes our desires are the first hint that we get. So Ignatius encourages us to pay attention to those desires, and again, to bring those desires before God in prayer. Okay, so those are the four kind of pillars of Ignatian spirituality: finding God in all things, becoming a contemplative in action, looking at the world in an incarnational way, and seeking freedom and detachment, so that we have those things in our lives that we value and that we care about, but we keep them in their right perspective and place. Two really big pieces of Ignatian spirituality. The first is something that Ignatius wrote called the Spiritual Exercises. And the Spiritual Exercises, in their original form, is a 4-week-long retreat for prayer and contemplation. The first week focuses on gratitude for God's gifts and an awareness of our own sinfulness. The second week is meditations on the life and ministry of Jesus. The third week is meditations on the passion of Jesus. And the fourth week is meditations on the resurrection of Jesus. Now, Ignatius recognized that not everybody can take 4 weeks to go on a retreat and dedicate their life to nothing but prayer and contemplation for 4 weeks. He believed in being contemplatives in action, after all. And so, while that is sort of the classic form, what's called the long retreat, he also provided various notes, like margin notes, on the spiritual exercises of places where they could be modified, of places where they could be tweaked or tailored for individuals, for instance, who have 9-to-5 jobs. I mean, he wouldn't have said 9-to-5 jobs because that's not a 16th century concept, but you get the idea that people who couldn't withdraw from the world for 4 weeks to do the exercises, he made other paths available. Again, a very practical spirituality, and again, very much like Luther, and this idea that, God meets you where you are, and that having a rich and deep life with God is not something limited to monastics or the clergy, but is something that is meant to be for all people. The other big contribution to the world of spirituality from Ignatius is something called the Examen, and we're going to talk more about that tomorrow. So be on the lookout for tomorrow. I will be posting another video, and that's going to be all about the Examen. Just as a little teaser, I find the Examen to be one of the most helpful spiritual tools I have ever found. In fact, it is the prayer that I most often pray, or the form of prayer that I most often use. And it is also one that Ignatius counseled his followers, if you skip every other kind of prayer in the day, don't skip the examen. So that's a little bit of a teaser. And tomorrow I'm going to lead you through sort of the basic examen or the classical examen, and then some variations on a theme. Some of them, literally hundreds of variations on ways to do the examen. So that'll be coming tomorrow. In closing, before I wrap this up, I just want to say I hope everybody watching this is coping with these strange days well. I know there's a lot of fear and anxiety in the world these days. Remember that God is with you. Remember that you are not alone in this. And remember that the God who promises to be with us is a God who is stronger and more powerful even than death itself. May God be with you and yours and bless you with peace and comfort in these trying times. Amen, and I'll see you tomorrow.